Well, here we are again. I watched a video on YouTube the other day called Storyville, the Story of Silk Road. And it was a BBC documentary. And to tell you the truth, I couldn't believe how awful and stupid it was. It was about the Silk Road and about Ross Ulbricht, who I think now is rotting in some federal prison. And what did Ross do? Well, Ross started a startup called the Silk Road. And what did the Silk Road do? Well, the Silk Road allowed people to trade openly for whatever they wanted. Now, I suppose they could have wanted anything. Tires, engines for a 1967 Volkswagen Bug. They could have wanted anything. But what this dealt with, pretty much all it dealt with, was that the Silk Road sold drugs. They were kind of an eBay for illicit, mind-altering drugs. That was the premise of the entire video, and how awful that was, and how the crack squad at the FBI was able to track down Ross after a lengthy and I'm sure very expensive manhunt and bring him to quote-unquote justice. So Ross's crime was to set up an eBay for getting high. Now, if somebody wants to get high right now, they have to go see some dealer, whether they know him or not, some sketchball guy, maybe down at the local hotel, and arrange to buy drugs. It's a fairly dangerous proposition. First of all, you can get ripped off. They may just steal your money. They could kill you, but they could take your money. The quality of drugs is unknown because who the hell knows what this dealer's carrying? It could be that he's cut whatever drug he has with anything from milk sugar to Drano. And there's a fairly limited quantity and supply of drugs for you to try. Usually the guy who's selling heroin, well, he may have ecstasy, he may have a couple other things, but he certainly doesn't carry the entire range of drugs you could use to get high. Now, of course, the unstated premise of the video was that getting high is bad, that you shouldn't do it, that it's dangerous, that these drugs are dangerous, and oh my God, if you take them, God only knows what'll happen. So Ross Ulbricht must be public enemy number one, because he had opened this international online eBay for drugs. And they went through the fact that they couldn't really stop him because people used the mail. They hid the drugs in video cartons and I don't know, everything from legal papers to whatever. But essentially, you put your credit card in, and it was like a PayPal deal. And once you put in your credit card, a few days later, the drugs would arrive. And not only were you able to buy the drugs, but then you were able to review the drugs and leave a like or comment, just like on eBay, where you could say, yeah, these were really good, or this was really pure, or this was really crappy, I didn't get off, or whatever. So it rated the drugs, so you could tell pretty much the quality of what you were getting, and that way guys who didn't sell very good drugs were known very quickly, and guys who sold good drugs, well, they got more business and more likes and, well, whatever else. So the premise of the story was that this was, oh my God, crap your pants terrible, and Ross Ulbricht was just the worst guy in the entire world. And then they showed the sympathetic character, a black FBI agent who was young and eager and wholesome and sort of gee whiz kind of guy. And he was the one who was going to track down and figure out who this awful Ross Ulbricht was and throw his butt in jail. And the story went on with this sort of gee whiz, G-man tracking down on the computer little telltale pieces of information about the terrible and dangerous Ross Ulbricht and how they finally captured his ass and put him in jail. And all I could think of the entire time I was watching this thing is, what a crock of shit. These guys, Ross Ulbricht, when you think about it, had done several things. First of all, he had made the drugs cheaper because a lot of the overhead from drugs, and we've seen this in states that have decriminalized marijuana and other things, a lot of the overhead from drugs is from the danger that is engendered in having to ship, keep, and deal drugs. It takes a lot of trouble, so you got to pay the people for their trouble. Well, this cut all that out. You didn't have to pay anybody for their trouble because there really wasn't that much trouble. They just had to package it up and put it in some box or something and send it to you, which, really didn't cause a lot of trouble for anybody. And what it meant was anybody who wanted to get high recreationally or as a habit could get a hold of essentially well-rated, criticized, quantified drugs and do so cheaply and safely so that they could do the drugs in the privacy of their own home. And this was considered just awful by the video makers because, my God, how would you track down these horrible drug dealers, and how would you catch them and throw them in jail? Well, the video presupposes a number of really ridiculous things. First of all, that somehow, before Silk Road, drugs to get you high were unavailable. And I think we all know, without having to think about it too hard, that that's a crock of shit. Second of all, that this was awful because it just meant that drugs were readily available and easy to get, which I have news for you. Based on all the information we have from the DEA and everybody else, they already are, okay? they're easy enough to get. If you want to get some kind of drug, you don't really have to work that hard, although there is a greater quotient of danger involved in getting it now. Second of all, the underlying supposition in this thing was that drugs are bad. Now, and that the government is in the business of protecting the people from these awful drugs. Now, we also know that's a crock of shit for several really good reasons. First of all, it has become known over the past several decades that our own government was involved in shipping and dealing drugs. And by that I mean cocaine. You can check out videos on Mena, Arkansas, Bobby Seale, Iran-Contra. You can check out videos on any of those things and see that the American government was financing a covert war using the proceeds from the sales of cocaine to its own people. All right. Second of all, we know that the government is in the business of vice altogether. It has picked a drug that it considers to be okay, and it taxes that drug. And in states where they legalized a second drug, marijuana, they use exactly the same model as the alcohol model to tax that drug. So it certainly isn't that the United States government somehow thinks that drugs are bad because they're involved in the drug trade. Whether they're taking excise tax from alcohol, which I think we can all agree is a drug, or from marijuana, which we can definitely agree is a drug, or cigarettes, which we can all believe that nicotine is a drug. These are all drugs that the federal government has approved under guidelines and allows to be sold and taxed to the American people. So the underlying premise that somehow the federal government is supposed to keep you from getting drugs because drugs are dangerous is a crock of shit. Second of all, the government, your government, federal, state, local, I don't care which one it is involved in the business of vice. If your state runs a lottery, it is involved in gambling. So the state approves of gambling as long as they're getting their cut. As a matter of fact, they even run gambling in terms of the lotto. They control the sales of alcohol, cigarettes. So really, if you think about it for longer than 5 minutes, the government's real position is drugs are okay as long as we tax them and control them. All right. So what did Ross really do? He figured out a way to safely convey drugs to anybody who wanted them. And if you don't want them, nobody forced you to go onto the Silk Road and buy them. No one even forced you to get near the Silk Road. So if you didn't feel like getting high, well, you just didn't go to the Silk Road. Now, we can look at opioid addiction in the United States and know right off the bat that something is going way wrong here. These people are legally obtaining incredibly dangerous substances. In many cases, they are prescribed. And once people get on opioids, we pretty much know how that goes. I worked in a drug rehab, and I was told by one of the doctors one time that the getting clean rate at a year for heroin, which is an opioid, was 3%. That meant out of every 100 people we treated, 3 of them at the end of the year would be clean. So there's an incredibly dangerous set of substances which are flooding the streets, the alleys, the clinics of the United States. And absolutely nothing is really being done about that. So the entire premise that the government somehow thinks that it's its job to protect you from taking drugs is just a crock of horse shit. What Ross really did was he figured out how to make drugs a lot safer by including a review section, putting together a history of the dealers so that you knew the quality of the drugs you were taking. He lowered the cost so that people that wanted to take drugs could get a hold of cheaper drugs more safely. Well, in this video, this junior G-man chased him down and finally found him sitting in a library in San Francisco, and they swooped in with all the G-men and caught him up and took him to jail because he was a bad man, which is an incredibly stupid and naive premise for a documentary. Now, I will say, in defense of this BBC documentary, that at the end of it, they interview some people who have to do with the internet and contraband shipped over the internet. And one of them said, look, they didn't stop the dealing of drugs on the internet. They just made it less safe. Now, why would the federal government go to all this trouble to track this guy down and put him in jail when really what they were accomplishing was making drug dealing less safe and ensuring that the people that did it had to go through more trouble to get the drugs they wanted? Well, I can think of a couple of reasons. First of all, no government was getting a cut from what Ross Ulbricht was doing. I mean, other than, I suppose, the bandwidth he was taking up and whatever else, no government was getting a cut from the proceeds of the dealing of these drugs. I think that's pretty central to the narrative. There was absolutely no revenue stream for the people we call government, and that was probably his first big sin. His second big sin, and they tried to step around this in the video, which I think was brilliant, was that if the Silk Road had succeeded, yeah, they concentrated on the mind-altering drugs, DMT, ecstasy, all that crap that you could get from the Silk Road. What they didn't concentrate on was that you could get any drug from the Silk Road, so that if you were poor in the United States and you needed, I don't know, doxycycline, you could probably get it cheaper from the Silk Road than you could get it from a pharmacy in the United States. And not just doxycycline, but let's say many, many other drugs that are used to treat diseases. They didn't go into this, but I really think it was the underlying reason for the fall of Ross Ulbricht and his classification as an enemy of the state. Why he's rotting in jail. Many times, drugs are available in other countries much more cheaply than they are in the United States. We know this. There is a contraband trade in shipping drugs, and I don't mean mind-altering drugs, but I mean medicinal drugs, from Canada and other places to the U.S., where those drugs are available for less money. Well, here we come to, I think, the real reason that Ross got nailed, was that we were on the verge of a new piece of commerce where you could get life-saving drugs as well as mind-altering drugs for a fraction of the price. And that challenged a whole lot of pharmaceutical business. The taking down of Ross Ulbricht really had to do with commerce. And it had to do with the fact that the entire paradigm that has been set up to provide drugs to the American people, whether they're mind-altering drugs or whether they are medicinal drugs, was being undercut by Rawls's new design. And the people that are responsible for providing the drugs to you now just were not going to let that happen. I think that's fairly obvious. So the G-men brought him down at great expense to the American public. And did it serve the American public? Well, I'm pretty sure that all the people that really wanted to get DMT or acid or magic mushrooms are still getting them. They cost more and it's more dangerous, but they're still getting them. Now, I've already made the prima facie case that the American government is even involved in and is certainly complicit in the dealing of dangerous drugs to its own population. So that really was not a part of this. And I've also made the case that this really didn't have anything to do with the taking of mind-altering drugs or dangerous drugs, because in many cases the government is in the business of taxing and controlling that trade. What it really was about was control. And it was about the old paradigm being broken down by a new paradigm. And basically the old paradigm was resisting forcibly, with violence, as they always do, this new brash upstart idea. So really, when you think about what Rawls did, what his crime really was a crime against the state, not against people who want to get high, or a crime against people who feel like taking drugs recreationally is a good idea, or in some cases chronically is a good idea, because the government certainly allows that to go on, but just as long as they control it. The idea here is control. And the thing about this BBC documentary is they make it sound like the government control of drugs is a good thing. Now, I think that's a pretty amazing case to make, and I certainly have seen that that's a crock of crap. Your government is not good by default. If you think that the underlying premise that somehow government control is good means that you're pretty stupid, really. And maybe it's something for everybody to think about, is what is the actual moral position of your government when it comes to drugs? It doesn't have one. Its real position is control. And that's what this was about. Rawls had subverted control. Think about that.